Well, we're back with Don Graves. I think if you want to know a little bit more about his biography, check out one of the previous episodes. I'll spare everyone going through all that again, but thrilled to be back with my favorite historian, especially when it comes to the War of 1812. And today we're going to carry on our conversation around the British Army and focus more on what it was like in North America during the War of 1812. So, Don, did I capture the essence of that?
Yeah, I think so. Uh, well, for the second half of the British Army, I'm just going to go through some of the regiments that fought in the war. Some had distinguished records, some had less than distinguished records. But you have to always remember that the British Army at that time, and even today, is basically a loose federation of tribal units called regiments. And each regiment has its distinct personality and life. So I'll talk a bit about the regiments. First of all, the one cavalry regiment, the 19th Light Dragoons, um, it came from Ireland. Two squadrons came from Ireland in spring of 1813, as soon as the shipping season opened. Unfortunately, they didn't bring their horses with them, which is kind of hard. So they went down to Montreal and when they tried to get mounted, but according to some of the correspondence, commanding officer did not like the horses that he found in Canada, British North America. So there was delay in getting them mounted. In the meantime, they had a delightful time in Montreal. According to the diary of Lieutenant John Lang, it was nothing but festivities and social life, parties and strawberry picnics and dances on the green. Finally, they got one squadron mounted and went down to the Niagara. And unfortunately for the 19th, they shipped their they sent their dress uniforms by vessel, um, and they were captured by the American squadron on Lake Ontario. So they had to go through the war pretty well much in their uh, what you call your daily dress, duty dress.
Yeah, fatigue, working dress, yeah.
Yeah, and none of this fancy stuff with shackles, a flat cap and single jacket and on and on and on. The one squadron got down into Niagara, participated in the Niagara campaign of 1813. The other squadron finally got mounted and it participated in the Plattsburgh campaign of 1814, but it didn't see a lot of action. I mean, Canada was not really cavalry country. It wasn't country for mounted troops. Then you get to the Royal Artillery. Now the Royal Artillery first formed in 1716. It was probably, along with the Royal Engineers, it was the most professional branch of the British Army. Um, it was organized into battalions, and there were separate companies within each battalion, but the battalion organization didn't mean anything. It was a company, and there were, I think, five companies in British North America. One company, Captain McLaughlin's company, was in the Niagara. The company would have about 125 gunners, but you could spread them around. Like you could take two trained gunners and three not well trained militia gunners and man a piece. So the company was spread along the Niagara. And it came together. It fought at let me think, Queenston Heights, George, around the blockade of Fort George. No, not Stony Creek, um, Chippewa, Lundy's Lane, and Fort Erie. The thing is, the British artillery, the Royal Artillery, they didn't. They're unlike the French artillery. You had distinct, different kinds of artillery units. You had field artillery, horse artillery, garrison artillery, and each company in the French army was designated according to its specialty. The British Army, Royal Artillery, you trained to do everything. So a company could man the garrison artillery, could man field artillery, could man siege artillery. It was quite flexible. Then we get to the infantry. Well, we gotta give praise to the first foot. It arrived in British North America in 1813. The first foot is a very, very old, is the most senior regiment in the line. It was formed, I think, in the 1630s. Um, I think it was a Swedish outfit. Maybe it was Dutch, but later it moved into the French army and fought as part of the French army. It was a mercenary unit. And then when Charles II was restored to the crown, it moved over to the British Army, and it prided itself on his venerable age and distinction. It called itself Pontius Pilate's bodyguard. That was and there's an old story about an officer of the first foot bragging to an officer from another regiment that they had stood guard over Christ's tomb. They were so distinguished and venerable, and the officer from the other regiment replied, and it was a good thing you did, because if my unit had been standing guard, he would have got out.
Or plundered the tomb, eh? So
Yeah. Then we go to the eighth foot, the King's foot, the King's regiment. Um, the first battalion had been in North America since 18, and it came up. It was in Nova Scotia, and then it came up into uh, Lower Canada first, and then Upper Canada. Um, it was joined in 1810 by the second battalion, and I'm not sure whether they were combined. I forget now. I'd have to look that up. But the eighth saw some action. It fought at Lundy's Lane, Chippewa, and Fort Erie, and what was partially present in the Niagara campaign of 1813. It was called the Kings. It was the King's Regiment, and often in documents you find you just you just see the title King's Regiment, not Eighth Foot. Brock had served in the Eighth Foot for a long time. Then we come to the 13th Foot, which arrived from the West Indies, then from the East Indies to the West Indies in 1813. Now, they were a trained light infantry unit, and the thing that was distinctive about them is that when they arrived, they were wearing white shakos made out of white felt instead of black felt. This was a thing that they'd done in India uh, to make them less hot. Uh,
cook the brains a little less and have a heavy black felt shako.
Problem was that they attracted bugs, and so they were pretty well moth-eaten when they arrived. And they fought very well at the Battle of the Coal Mill in the spring of 1814, um, and gained a lot of reputation because of that. Now we come to a very, very uh, I don't know how to say this tactfully, uh, a regiment that was had its ups and downs, and that's the 41st Foot, which you know a lot about.
Yes.
They had been in the country since 1798, too long, I think. Regiments that look, British North America was a good station. Wasn't any disease. There was liquor, fairly available. You could hunt if you were an enlisted man to eke out your diet. But I think a lot of these regiments had been here a long time. Discipline started to get slack. And the other thing about the British regiments that were in country for a long time, they couldn't recruit in Canada, but they could commission Canadians as officers. And as you know, the 41st had a lot of officers. My favorite story about the 41st concerns the Winslow Affair. Do you know about that?
Yeah, we've chatted about that. Cartwright and Winslow, right? And the infamous brawl in the officers' mess. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you want me to go over it again? Because
Yeah,
it's
it's worth repeating for our audience. I'm familiar with it. They may not be. So
Lieutenant Winslow was the son of a judge, Superior Court judge in New Brunswick. He grew up in a wealthy home, and he had five sisters, no brothers. And his father managed to get him a commission in the Nova Scotia Fencibles. He was 16 or 17. So he went off to Newfoundland, where the Nova Scotia Fencibles were stationed. But there not being much to do in the garrison because they weren't really being threatened by the French or the Americans. All I could do was drink and gamble. And his father felt that he was getting a little dangerous in his gambling, and so arranged a transfer to the 41st. Now, he arrived at the 41st. He didn't go right into the regiment. He went to Fort Erie, where there was a company stationed, and the company commander and his wife sort of took him in. So you got to see he's a young teenager brought up by five sisters who spoiled him rotten. And first station he gets in Upper Canada, he's kind of mollycoddled and treated very well by this couple. Then he's transferred to Fort George. This is before. This is right about the time the war broke out, and no, would have been October. I have it in my notes somewhere. Anyway, the first night that he dines in the officers' mess with most of the officers of the 41st, the custom was that you dined, and then they removed the tablecloth, and the more senior officers left the mess as captain and above, in subalterns, would then drink up any port or wine that had been decanted for the dinner because you couldn't just leave it; it'd go stale. That was an excuse anyway.
Yeah.
So young Winslow got a snout full of wine, and there was another Canadian officer, Cartwright, son of a very prominent um, businessman in Kingston, Richard Cartwright. And their words were exchanged, and the two stood up, and I guess the Winslow lost his self-control and dinged old Cartwright right upside the ear, and that was it. But then Brock was at Fort George, and he heard about this, and he was just furious. He ordered both these officers, Canadian officers, to turn in their resignations forthwith. They're out of the regiment. They were a disgrace to the British Army. Although I think some things just as bad as that went on, but yeah, if senior officers didn't hear about it, better for all concerned. Anyway, Cartwright submitted his resignation, but his father, having connections, stopped it, going to the Horse Guards in London and making it official. Winslow didn't quite have those connections, and his went through. But just about this time, the Battle of Queenston Heights took place, and the 41st marched out, and Winslow, not being an officer anymore officially, grabbed a musket and marched out and fought in the ranks. And General Schaeff, thought that was a very admirable thing, and offered to get him an anciennicy, which is a rank lower than what he had. And Winslow didn't like that. He wanted his old rank back. But Schaeff couldn't convince him. So Winslow then enlisted in the 104th Foot, the New Brunswick Regiment, as a volunteer. Now, volunteer was a man who messed with the officers and served with the ranks, and he would be in a regiment until there was a vacancy that occurred through sickness or combat, and then the commanding officer might appoint him to that vacancy. So it was a risky thing. Some of the literature I read, I will admit, it's from the Peninsula Campaign. Volunteers weren't well regarded by either officers or men because they were neither fish nor fowl.
Yeah.
Anyway, Winslow went through the rest of the war as a volunteer. At the end of the war, he got his commission back, retired from the army, became a sheriff in New Brunswick. He's still a hot-tempered guy. Fought a lot of duels in his life, and that will end Winslow. The rest of the 41st story you're familiar with. Uh, I don't know about that regiment. I really don't.
Yeah, it could be a whole nother subject, right? Gentlemen volunteers. It's funny, the 41st had a number of them. One of the more prominent was Richardson, right, who wrote his account of the War of 1812. And I think Henry Proctor's son was also a gentleman's volunteer early on, River Raisin, Fort Meigs. But with the 41st, yeah, you're right about long service in Canada because a regiment was posted in Upper Canada. They were never together. Like you would see a company or two would be at Fort St. Joseph, a company would be in Amherstburg, a company at Fort Erie, maybe someone Chippewa, Queenstown. Well, like they're scattered all over the place. So it would be extremely difficult to manage that. But I think the big thing was there was a real rift in the officers' mess. I kind of, on the one side, those associated with Adam Muir, who was come up through the ranks, was sergeant major, become adjutant, and continue to get promoted. And the other was Peter Latouche Chambers, who was more of a gentleman, but a really caustic gentleman, that no one seemed to like. But all the officers were either in one camp or the other. And Proctor, who himself was a miserable old bugger, he couldn't manage any of that. So it just led to a lot
Lost-
of problems. What's that?
I can't hear you.
Oh, I was just talking about the
You still
rift.
there?
Yep. Is that better, or can you hear
Lost the
me?
volume. Hang on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Well, I lost the volume on your side.
All right. I was talking about the rift and the officers' mess, the two camps, Muir and Chambers, and then Proctor's inability to manage all of that. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
and you see it like the court martial of Benoit Bender, who was a Canadian officer, but also Muir's brother-in-law, right? And that was Chambers dragging him through the mud, and then Proctor's own court martial. So, yeah, some very good things, some hard service, but also some checkered incidents. So,
well, then we get to the 49th, which is another regiment that had been in Canada since 1803. And again, you have a fair number of Canadians, but this was Brock commanded this regiment. And by time the war broke out, he said they'd been in the country too long and been drinking too much. But they fought well. Um, the 41st and 49th were really the two regiments that were the um, backbone of the defense of Canada in 1812. And the 49th, of course, had Fitzgibbon and the Green Tigers. And I'm not sure about all these legends about Fitzgibbon. Um, then we go to the second 89th, Second Battalion, 89th Foot, which was an Irish regiment. A lot of regiments were Irish almost to the core because Ireland provided a very steady stream of recruits, constantly expanding population. So the second 89th was a Irish regiment. They had taken a brief part in the Peninsular War, to wit, they got wiped out making a raid on the east coast of Spain on a French um, fortification, Ferrangola. Then they brought over the British North America in 1812, and they were in Montreal and moved up to Kingston, and they formed the backbone of Colonel Morrison's little army, which followed Wilkinson's American army down the St. Lawrence and finally brought them to ground at Chrysler's Farm. And they played a major role at Chrysler's Farm, along with the 49th. Then they were sent to Prescott, an area, over the winter. Now, Surgeon William Dunlop, I'm sure you read his memoirs.
yeah,
Great.
Tiger Dunlop. Yes, yeah,
No, it's a great memoir. he talks about they were in a blockhouse. Uh, he was with three other officers. They were in a yeah, it wasn't a blockhouse, but he uses the phrase that two of those officers were better accommodated than with wives. Now that's a Shakespearean expression. That means to be better accommodated than with a wife means you got a mistress. So you don't have to put up all the crap if you're not married to her. Anyway, these two guys had ladies. So Dunlop and the other officer felt they should get out of the blockhouse, and they found a billet in I think it was a blacksmith shop or carpenter shop, and they had a good time. He said it was a good time over the winter, lots of wine to drink, and the locals uh, treated them very well. There was hunting and fishing and shooting. The 89th then went down to the Niagara in the spring of 1814, fought at Lundy's Lane and Fort Erie. They're a good outfit. Uh, then we come to another Irish outfit, the 100th Foot Prince Regent's County of Dublin Regiment. And these were a bunch of rascals, as many of these Irish regiments were. Uh, they were on their way to Canada, and they had a major shipwreck in the St. Lawrence and lost a lot of people. Um, there was a private in that regiment called George Ferguson, who was a lay Methodist preacher, and he must have been a terrible comrade because he didn't like to drink, smoke, or anything else. Had his wife with him, and
And from what I recall, he didn't like shooting at the enemy either. He'd deliberately fire high so he wouldn't hit anyone. So
no, when the war was over, he said he only fired his musket twice, and he was sure he didn't hit anyone. It's too bad he didn't desert, you know. But anyway, for there, the ship is like rocking back and forth. Ship, the water coming on board, and all his comrades are going, "Oh God!" So he proceeds to lay into them with this massive sermon, lengthy sermon about living bad, drinking and smoking, and hanging out with loose moral women or women with loose morals. You know, he must have been a delightful guy to have in barracks. Uh, and his diary is interesting, although you won't find much fighting in it. But it's very interesting because he was allowed, which is rare. He was allowed to leave the regiment for times and go preach to the civilian population. He would preach to Methodist congregations, and finally the Methodists bought him out of service, which you could do, and he became a full-time Methodist preacher. But the story I love about the 100th is, and I don't know where I got this. Uh, the fall of Fort Niagara, they were involved in the attack on Fort Niagara, the Grenadier Company and Light Company. And when General Drummond, or maybe it was Ryle, maybe it was Drummond, rode through the main gates of Fort Niagara the next day, two privates of the 100th Foot had got into the whiskey store and were dancing a jig on the roof of the big French castle. And Drummond was not amused, you know, get those men down right now. Yeah, good old 100th. Um, and then, of course, Morris Nolan was an officer in the 100th Grenadiers. Um, his letters are in the Montreal archives, no, the Quebec archives in Montreal. He wrote letters, and these are love letters. He was married in the spring of 1813, and he was writing his wife all the time. And I read these things, and I got so frustrated with this guy. Like he was in the attack on Sackett's Harbor, and he was one of his company charged across the causeway from Horse Island to the mainland, right into the face of a 6-pounder gun, and which fired at them. But he doesn't mention that hardly at all. He just says, you know, yeah, oh, we attacked Sackett's Harbor. It was a rough business, and we lost a lot of men. My darling, I can't wait to be in your arms and on to paragraph after paragraph, romantic drivel. It's just you get frustrated when you're a historian because I haven't come across any eyewitness accounts to that particular um, attack, and it must have been a hell of an attack. His last letter he wrote the night before the 100th foot attack Fort Niagara, and I quoted in one of my books, and he's telling his wife, um, don't worry if you don't hear from me for some time, because it may take time to get communications. She's in Montreal, by the way. Um, and then he scribbles at the bottom, my darling, it really hurts me to leave you, etc. Well, he doesn't make it. He's found in one of the um, redoubts in Fort Niagara with two dead Americans in front of him. So there you go.
Huh.
That's say what?
No, I was just just acknowledging, saying, "Wow." So who's next? 103rd?
Yeah, they arrived. They're a mixed up regiment. Uh, they arrived in when did they come?
Weren't they largely like a holding regiment? Like take
That's
all the
how they
kids, put them in there, and then once they mature
yeah,
enough, transfer them into other regiments?
they had two companies, or maybe it was three, of underage males, 15, 16, not fully grown. And they would hold them until they were developed enough to be soldiers and send them to other regiments, I think. But they did get into combat at Fort Erie. They got wiped out because they made that attack on the southeastern redoubt. Wait a minute, northeastern redoubt.
Weren't
Uh,
they on I don't know what they call like the Watergate or whatever like that? The one along the river. Like there was an American battery there. Yeah,
you think?
that would probably be southeast. So yeah,
Are you
and then
thinking Conjecta Creek?
no. I think in the point of attacks at Fort Erie there was Snake Hill,
Yeah, it
and
was. They were the closest to the river. They came down the road.
yeah, that's
And
what I called kind of like the Watergate or the water battery. I forget what they called it, but I think Royal Navy were with them and some others, part of that storming
no, it
party.
was 100. Next column to the right under William Drummond had Royal Navy, few Marines, 104th Flank Companies, and it was a mixture
41st.
of that was sorry.
I think the 41st were with Drummond, or they followed up the attack. I know they were in there when the explosion happened. So,
Flank Companies is 141st. Oh,
yeah,
by the way, one more thing about the 41st. They had the worst commander, John Goulston Price Tucker. Talk about that idiot. Uh, at Conjecture Creek, we'll talk about him when we get on to operations. But this guy, I don't know.
well,
This
that was it. That was in Luc Couture's journal, right? His nickname wasn't it Brigadier Shindy or something like that?
yeah, that's a nickname, and that's what the other officers were calling. And of course, Shindy is a dance, so it was like airhead was be the best way I could translate it.
Yeah.
But that was all he did. He 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 was into psychological warfare, stuff like this, and most of the psychology was out of his rather weak mind. We'll get on with that. Then we come to the 104th. Uh, well, we know a lot about the 104th. There's a solid history, and you've got Lee Couture's memoir, which goes into detail. Uh, they started life as the New Brunswick Fencibles, and then in 1809 or 10, they volunteered for the line and became the 104th Foot. They were stationed in Fredericton until February 1813 when they made that famous trek overland in the winter to Quebec City, then Montreal, then Kingston. And I think it really killed them. I think they got a lot of sickness from that. They were in the attack on Sackett's Harbor. They were in the Niagara in 1813. A lot of desertions from that regiment. a lot of sickness. They were brought back to Kingston, but they didn't participate in the Chrysler's Farm campaign. But in the spring of 1814, they sent the flank companies only. You were saying the other day that often when a regiment really got drained, they would build up the flank companies and they would represent the regiment. That's what happened with the 104th. They built up the two flank companies and they went down to the Niagara. Um, they fought at Lundy's Lane, Fort Erie. They had a bad time. They lost their commanding officer. Cook's Mills or Lions Creek, whichever you prefer.
Yeah.
But they were a good outfit, but I think that winter march ruined their health. But Licoteur is just full of stories about the 104th. So I'll leave it then. Now we got to move on to defensible regiments. And that is we'll make some, see, you've got some notes here. As I said the other day, there's no difference between a fencible regiment and a regular British regiment, except that a fencible regiment was not required to serve outside British North America. They were raised for local defense, defensible. Defensible, it's the root of the word defense, fencible. So we got the Royal Newfoundland fencibles. And they played a major part when I think it hasn't been given enough attention. They were watermen, naturally enough, being recruited in Newfoundland. They manned boat convoys coming up the St. Lawrence. They were involved in the two attacks on Mackinac. A sizable number fought on the naval battle of Lake Erie and were captured. Spent a miserable time, as did the 41st in the prison camp. Where else were they at? Oh, yeah, they were involved in the capture of the Tigris and Scorpion.
One of
But there's no,
one of my favorite actions that is relatively unknown. It's just incredible the distance they covered and what they pulled off with that.
yeah, yeah. But the problem was they were scattered all over. There's a company here, a detachment there. They never fought together as a unit, so they never got the attention they should have gotten. Um, but it's Royal Newfoundland. Then you've got the New Brunswick fencibles, which were raised after the first New Brunswick fencibles became the 104th. They stayed in the Maritimes throughout the war. Yeah, the Nova Scotia fencibles, which started, oddly enough, garrisoning Newfoundland after the Royal Newfoundland Regiment left, and then were brought up to Montreal by the end of the war. Then you've got the Canadian fencibles. Now, they were a very, very strange outfit. They'd been recruited they were nearly 9 years in service. They were recruited in Lower Canada. I should mention that unlike British regular regiments, fencible regiments could recruit in British North America. How else are you going to get men? Um, Recruited in Lower Canada, and there were a lot of Americans. I mean, Americans, because don't forget Montreal was a commercial center. It was a wealthy city. It was trade. It was the center of the fur trade, which is a major economic enterprise. And there were a lot of Americans coming up doing business, maybe falling on hard times, and so enlist. So there was always a certain reluctance to trust the Canadian fencibles. Uh, and they also had a reputation as thieves. So I'm sure there's reenactors out there who are doing the Canadian fencibles going to watch this, curse me, throw things at the screen, etc. But that's the truth. Uh, anyway, they got down to Prescott in summer of 1813, and two companies. I never figured this out. It was either two companies or a detachment in the strength of two companies were in Morrison's little army and fought at Chrysler's Farm, and he did well, except they were accused of looting the dead. Um, but what can you say? That's the Canadian Fencibles. Now, the last of the Fencible regiments were the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles, which were recruited in Glengarry and adjacent areas, Glengarry County on the St. Lawrence, where there was a sizable uh, settlement of Catholic Scots who had been in a former Glengarry Fencible regiment in Scotland, which was disbanded, and they'd come to Canada. So they were a very tightly knit unit. They were a light infantry unit, and they wore green uniform like the British Rifle regiments, and they were trained as light infantry, uh, and they served very well. But again, quite often in detachments, they put a detachment here, a company here, a company there. They serve very well. I can't. I'm just trying to think of. I don't think there was a major battle from the spring of 1813. They were at Stony Creek. They were at the attack on Fort George. Uh,
I know they were at Lundy's Lane. They got fired upon, right? Friendly fire. So yeah.
I know. I'm just trying to think whether they were at. I don't think they were at Chippewa. They were at Fort Erie. They were all over the place. Good, solid, steady regiment. Uh,
Now I'm speaking from an impression where a full strength regiment would be 1,000 men. Like I don't think the Glengarrys were ever that many. Were they 300 or 400 men, or do you have a
Probably.
sense?
I've got time to look it up, but I have the quote of their warrant, the raising warrant. It's the raising warrant you have to look at because they didn't have a standard number for a regiment. It could be 8 companies, could be 10, could be 800, could be 1,000. But their warrant, I think, was for around 400. But yeah, oh yeah, I remember now. The attack on Ogdensburg across the ice. They were very prominent in that. And about every third man was named MacDonnell. And
Well, you go to that Glengarry country, everyone's MacDonnell up in that area. So
I'm having trouble with this speaker. Can you hear me now?
yeah, no, I could hear you all along. So all right, and then the Glengarrys were part of the attack on Fort Ontario, right, in Oswego.
Yep. I, see, I've overlooked that. A lot of battles. I want to get back to Bishop MacDonnell because he's another of these characters. When they went across the ice, the Glengarrys and the militia, he marched behind the last rank, swinging a huge crucifix. And if any man looked like he was going to be laggard in doing his duty, he'd get whacked with the crucifix and told to get it going. And there was one guy just wouldn't go, so he excommunicated him on the spot. And after the battle was over, they brought the wounded back to a tavern on the Canadian side. And in those days, uh, you had a tap room, you had the bar, and then a tap room, which was basically um, a little booth in the corner. And from there, you dispensed liquor and wine, but it wasn't open all the time. And the owner of this tavern was an American, and he said he couldn't open it. MacDonnell wanted some brandy to give to the wounded, and he told the bishop that he couldn't do it because against it wasn't serving hours, and it was against the law. Well, MacDonnell got really fed up, walked over to the door, and kicked the door off its hinges, got the brandy for the wounded, and then dispensed alcohol to everybody who wanted it, wounded or not. I like that. I like that. Uh, all right, so we trying to think of
Uh,
this.
how about the mercenary, the Swiss regiments?
Okay, well, Demers and the Watvilles were Swiss regiments raised for Dutch service and then brought into British service. I think they were both in the East Indies, and when Britain took Java, they were brought into British service. Now they were nominally Swiss, but really by the War of 1812, only the officers were Swiss. Most of the men were from every nation in Europe. Um, I had someone tell me, I think it was a Lithuanian descent, had been looking at their muster list, and and spotted 5 or 6 Lithuanians, could tell by the names. I don't know about that. Anyway, the Wattvilles came up. Um, they participated in the attack on, let me see, Oswego. Did very well. They fought at Lundy's Lane and Fort Erie. Uh, they're a unique unit, but the problem was they suffered from desertion, and it was hard. You couldn't really depend on them. I'm not saying they weren't bad soldiers, but a lot of guys that deserted from Napoleon's army joined the Wattvilles, got to North America. They're a couple of miles from the United States, which is a very free country where a man could, come from humble origins and rise to in status, et cetera, et cetera. So they deserve it. I said this before. There's a constant traffic going back and forth of desertion. 10% of the American Army deserted during the war. Uh, of the British Army, 1,500 men deserted, and it wasn't quite the heinous crime it was in the 20th century. Um, but at the same time, it was punished very, very heavily, especially if you deserted with your arms to the enemy. If you were caught, well, it's a firing squad. Uh, anyway, okay, the Wattvilles, good regiment, but not great. The Mirons got into the Plattsburgh campaign of 1814, and again, didn't do a lot. Didn't weren't in the battle, and but suffered from desertion. I should mention that they were brigaded with what was left of the 49th Foot, and the 49th Foot had a high rate of desertion by the time too. Um, so I think that's all I want to talk about British regiments. You must have some questions.
Yeah, how about we give our audience a sense for as the war progressed and things were happening in Europe, including the abdication of Napoleon, and then you had a lot of Wellington's regiments transferred to North America, right? So if you go year by year, the strength of the British regulars in upper and lower Canada went from, I don't know, like 5,000 men to like over 20,000 men.
Well, I think by the end of the war, Sir George Prevost had more regular troops under his command than the Duke of Wellington ever had. And he was getting up. I could check this, but I was going to say 37,000. And that's almost as many troops as the American regular army had. Thank goodness you said those Wellington's men coming over, because that reminds me that one of my favorite regiments came over. At the end of the war in 1814, Wellington's army was in the Toulouse area, and they were having a great time. The war is over, you know. The, the weather's good, lots of wine. Women are friendly, really friendly women, all kinds of marriages going on. They had so much wine they were using it to cook their potatoes. One memoir says. Anyway, Wellington was told to detach regiments for North America, and he picked the strongest regiments. That's how they were picked, and so off they go. And a lot of these regiments had been in the peninsula for 4 or 5 years. And the men had married Portuguese and Spanish women, or well, had married them, but they had not in front of clergy. In other words, they hadn't been churched. So Wellington, who was, by the way, a cold fish, he said they can't come marching back to Spain and Portugal. So they did. They mustered them all, and the Spanish and Portuguese army marched this little army of wives and children, which were organized according to the regiments and brigades their husbands had been in. And one Portuguese officer said he had never seen such a desperate, horrible, painful, wearisome duty in all of his life. Anyway, they shipped the regiments over. 21 battalions of infantry came over in 1814, and 16 of them, I think it's 16, went to British North America, which tells you right there that there was a great plan to have a great offensive to conquer the U.S., contrary to what many American authors imply or say. But my favorite regiment arrived was the 88th Foot, the Connaught Rangers. By God, there's an Irish regiment. I love these guys. Wellington once said he hanged and shot more of them than any other regiment in his army, but he was always glad to see their face on the field of battle because they were they were real tough fight. Uh, my favorite story concerning the 88th Foot uh, was there in Saint Jean, Quebec. I think this was, I'm not sure, it was after or before the Plattsburgh campaign. And there were some young officers. Really, Saint Jean, Quebec wasn't really much to do. And if you went to a social uh, uh, reception or party, you were you were had all these Canadian girls trying to hang off you because their mothers were there trying to get them married. And a British officer, that was a good pick for a Canadian girl. Anyway, these four young officers were walking back. They had dinner with the local garrison commander, and they were walking back down the street. It's dark. And they passed the tavern, and they could hear this fiddles and drums. And they looked up, uh, and they could see shadows dancing. People were dancing. There was a ball. You have to remember that in those days, the ball was usually on the first floor, not the ground floor of a tavern, because the ground floor is where they looked after guests. And if they had street frontage, they're often small shops. So anyway, these 488th Connaught Rangers walk up the stairs. They get to the top of the stairs, and this tall scarecrow Yankee he was. They right away came and said, well, "What do you think you're doing?" And uh, the officer said, "Well, having a ball. We just like to attend. If there's a subscription, a ticket, we're glad to pay the price." Well, Yankee said, "Well, I guess just not. You redcoats better get the hell out of here. We don't like redcoats. This is American on Canadian territory." Well, there's only one reply to that, and the young Connaught Ranger officer flattened him, and that started a brawl. And you have the. It turns out that this was a group of American smugglers who brought cattle over the border and got gold, and we're going to spend it. So we're having and set up this ball. There's this great fight breaks out between these four officers who are standing back to back, and the smugglers are attacking them, and the women are screaming. And then in the middle of this, somebody knocks over the stove, right? And the stovepipe, and it's hot coals on the floor. And then we've got fire starting. Women dresses are catching on fire. Everybody's trying to get down the stairs, and so finally the quarter guard from the garrison arrives under a sergeant who gets everything under control, puts out the fire, does this and that. And the problem was, I don't know what, but something had dripped onto through the floor, and there was an apothecary's shop, and it ruined his store of medicines, and he wanted his damages recovered. So these four young officers got nailed for 100, I think it was 130 pounds. It was the annual pay of a second lieutenant, but they had to whip around in the regiment and they paid it off. Meanwhile, the American smugglers took them to court. Uh, Unfortunately, it was a Canadian court and a Canadian judge who threw it out dismissed them as a rabble, Republicans. How dare they come into our country, threw it out of court. Well, that's Canadian justice for you. That's my favorite 88-foot story. So,
That's
any more questions?
yeah. How about as the numbers rose, I think Prevost had a real reputation of starving Upper Canada of troops, right? He kind of husbanded them and kept them for his own use or the defense of Quebec.
That's been implied. I don't think so. I mean, he's been accused of starving Western Upper Canada, Proctor, of troops, of starving Downey on Lake Erie of sailors. Really, the bottleneck was um, what not Yo, Sir George Yo, the naval commander of Lake Ontario. He was taking the naval reinforcements and putting them on his squadron and not sending them on. And it may well have been that de Watteville, de Rotenberg, was keeping troops because at this time he's abandoned the Niagara Peninsula and he wants to keep troops at Burlington Bay or Hamilton or York in case the Americans go on the defensive. I think all said and done, there's Grzinski's study of Prevost. It's the only one ever done of the man, and it's fair in his assessment. He was a cautious general. There's no doubt about it. But don't forget, um, what was important in British North America was Montreal, Quebec, and the maritime colonies. Upper Canada is this just barely settled province surrounded on three sides by American territory. If you got to cut back, you're going to cut back. You're going to cut that province, and that's the way it was.
It's kind of a long-standing defensive strategy too, right? If all goes to hell, fall back on Quebec, hold that at all costs, and then that's your deep water port where the Royal Navy can bring in reinforcements and save your
Exactly.
bacon.
But Britain fought a defensive war. It made attacks on um, um, towns on the border, what I would call preemptive strikes, but they only mounted one major. Well, okay, Brock took Detroit, and then they surrendered the Michigan territory. He didn't ask for it; they gave it to him. So then you've got a whole campaign down there to retain it, which didn't go well. That was unplanned. That was not planned by Prevost. It just happened by accident. The only major offensive uh, that Britain mounted during the war was the offensive against Plattsburgh in 1814, and we know how that ended up. But other than that, like the raid on Oswego, the raid in Sackett's Harbor, the raid in Ogdensburg, the burning of the American side of the Niagara, these are all preemptive strikes. It's Britain fought a defensive war. You have to remember, almost from the day that war was declared, one side or the other was trying to figure out how to bring it to the negotiating table, and neither side really wanted to fight this war. They got backed into it. So I would say overall, Prevost did a good job, and he got no thanks for it. Uh, uh, One thing he did do when all those units came over from Wellington's army, they were the Peninsula Army dressed like it wanted. Wellington didn't give a damn what his officers wore, as long as his men had shoe leather, they were fed, and they had 60 rounds of ball cartridge. That's all he was concerned about. The only thing, in fact, the only order he issued on dress was he couldn't stand officers riding into battle or otherwise with umbrellas. This really is a little. Anyway, so these guys come over and they get off the boat at Quebec and they're wearing the weirdest outfits, surtouts, which are like a dressing gown over all, surtout overall, everything. They've got weird hats like uh, um, scholars, mortar boards. Um, they got cigars. In fact, one of them said The only thing we were missing was bells. Uh, Prevost takes one look at this, and he couldn't stand it. And I quote that order in one of my books, and issues an order that, you know, officers and this commander to wear the regulated uniform of Her Majesty, and they didn't like that. That was one of the first things that sort of turned them against Prevost. They had other issues with him too.
The other thing, as I understand it, the peninsular regiments in their service there, they had streamlined the drill. Like instead of the four count, like with the pauses,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
they had quickened that up. And then the other issue they had was that Prevost demanded that they execute the manual as it was written, not as they had been practicing over in the peninsula. So
yeah. Well, that these guys had been through 5 years of campaigning. The 88th Foot, for instance, were never dismissed from a parade, a regimental parade, unless they did um, uh, uh, an evolution from deploying from line to column, deploying from line to square, deploying from square to line. They would do one or two evolutions every day. Every day, and they streamlined the whole 1792 regulations and the platoon drill. But Prevost, yeah, I could see where they would be. Who is this guy anyway? The thing about Prevost was he was actually a fairly good general. He commanded in the Martinique campaign of 1809, and he did very well. But when he got his civil responsibility, he was the lieutenant governor of Nova Scotia as well as the commander of Nova Scotia, and then he became the governor general of Canada as well as the commander in chief. It kind of weighed on him. The civil side sort of weighed more than the military side. And he wasn't the only British officer I've come across who uh, who had a similar situation. But he was responsible. I mean, the pound note stopped at his desk, and he didn't like to take casualties. But as I said a couple episodes ago, you couldn't replace them. You take a year to get replacements, which is why units like the 41st and 49th just gradually wore down.
maybe a closing note. I find it interesting that the escalation of troops in Upper and Lower Canada had an implication on the Battle of Waterloo, right? Because when they were working out, preparing for the return of Napoleon in a campaign there, Wellington didn't have access to his best regiments, right?
Yeah, yeah. He said if I had the army I had in Spain, it would have been a different campaign. He fought a defensive campaign. As Surgeon Dunlop of the 89th Foot remarked, "Thank God the Duke managed to do without us at Waterloo." I don't know. The second 89th would have done at Waterloo, but there were some good regiments like the 88th Foot that he would have loved to have seen in his army.
All right. Well, thank you, Don. I think we'll wrap up here. That's the British Army as it was in North America during the War of 1812. And our next episode will turn our attention to more of the militia units, the Canadian militia. So